Imagine waking up to a world where the horizon has vanished, erased completely by a wall of white that swallowed entire towns overnight. This wasn't just a heavy snowfall. It was an atmospheric bomb that exploded over the United States, paralyzing half the nation and turning highways into frozen graveyards. Roads disappeared. Power grids failed, and thousands of people found themselves fighting for survival in their own cars and living rooms. This is the story of the Great Blizzard of 1978, a storm so catastrophic that it fundamentally changed how we predict weather and manage disasters. It remains the benchmark against which all other winter storms are measured, a terrifying reminder of nature's absolute power over civilization. In late January 1978, the winter had been typical for the Midwest and New England, cold but manageable. Meteorological models at the time, which were far less advanced than today's supercomputers, showed two distinct storm systems, one coming from the south and another Arctic front descending from Canada. Forecasters predicted snow, but few realized the timing of these two systems would result in a historic collision. People went to work and sent their kids to school, assuming they would be home for dinner as usual. There was an eerie sense of normalcy before the sky turned gray and the barometer began its deadly descent. What happened next is known in meteorology as explosive cyclogenesis, or more dramatically, a weather bomb. The moist-rich cyclone from the south merged perfectly with the freezing Arctic air, causing the barometric pressure to drop at a rate rarely seen outside of tropical hurricanes. This rapid intensification generated massive amounts of energy, fueling winds that would soon reach over 100 miles per hour. The two systems locked together and stalled over the Ohio Valley and the Northeast, creating a spinning vortex of ice and wind. It was a worst-case scenario that caught millions of Americans completely off guard. The storm struck with ferocious speed during the early morning hours, catching the regions between shifts. In Ohio, the temperature plummeted nearly 30 degrees in a matter of hours, turning rain instantly into ice and then into blinding snow. The wind didn't just blow. It roared, whipping the snow into a frenzy that made it impossible to tell the sky from the ground. This wasn't just falling snow. It was a horizontal assault that stung exposed skin like sand. By dawn, the white hurricane had fully engulfed the region, and the trap was set. Because the storm intensified so quickly during the workday, panic set in, and employers sent everyone home at the same time. This resulted in the worst traffic jam in the history of the Northeast. Just as the blizzard conditions hit their peak, thousands of commuters on Route 128 in Massachusetts became trapped as their cars lost traction and the snow piled up around them faster than they could clear it. The highway transformed into a 15-mile-long parking lot of buried vehicles, forcing drivers to make a terrifying choice: stay in their cars and risk freezing, or step out into the whiteout to find help. The atmospheric pressure reading in Cleveland, Ohio, dropped to a staggering 958 millibars, the lowest non-tropical pressure ever recorded in the mainland United States at that time. This extreme low pressure acted like a vacuum, sucking in air from all directions and generating wind gusts that tore roofs off buildings. It was essentially an inland hurricane made of ice, destroying mobile homes and snapping power lines like twigs. The sheer weight of the atmosphere was crushing, and the structural damage to buildings was comparable to a war zone. While the Midwest battled the wind and cold, the coast of New England faced a watery apocalypse. The storm stalled through 4 consecutive high tide cycles, including a massive spring tide, sending the Atlantic Ocean surging into coastal towns. Waves as high as 40 feet battered the shoreline, ripping houses from their foundations and smashing them into kindling. In towns like Scituate and Revere, the ocean didn't just flood the streets. It brought giant chunks of ice that acted like battering rams against homes. The situation in these coastal towns became a surreal nightmare of fire and ice. As saltwater flooded homes, it shorted out electrical systems, sparking fires that raged out of control because fire trucks couldn't reach them through the floodwaters. Firefighters showed incredible bravery, using rowboats to navigate icy streets to rescue trapped residents from their attics. People watched from their upper windows as their neighbors' homes burned down, while simultaneously being surrounded by freezing water. It was a scene of devastation that looked more like the aftermath of a bombing than a winter storm. By the second day, the governors of the affected states declared total states of emergency, realizing that civilian infrastructure had collapsed. Standard ambulances and police cruisers were useless in snowdrifts that reached 15 to 20 feet high. The National Guard was mobilized, bringing in tanks and armored personnel carriers to patrol city streets. These military vehicles were the only things capable of smashing through the drifts to deliver emergency medical supplies. The sight of tanks rolling down suburban avenues underscored the severity of the crisis. The Department of Public Works fought a losing battle from the very beginning. The snow was falling at a rate of 3 to 4 inches per hour, meaning that as soon as a plow cleared a lane, it was covered again within minutes. Even the massive heavy-duty plows were getting stuck or running out of fuel, becoming obstacles themselves. In many areas, the snow was so deep and heavy that it broke the axles of the removal equipment. The authorities eventually had to give up and wait for the winds to die down before resuming the fight. Out at sea, the terror was absolute for mariners caught in the tempest. The Greek tanker Global Hope was dragged by the winds and ran aground in Salem Sound, sparking a dramatic rescue operation. The Coast Guard pilot, Captain Frank McHugh, flew his helicopter backward into the gale force winds to hoist the crew to safety, battling turbulence that nearly swatted the aircraft out of the sky. It was one of the most daring rescues in Coast Guard history, performed in conditions that theoretically shouldn't have allowed for flight, with thousands of motorists stranded and power outages affecting millions. Makeshift shelters were set up in schools, churches, and police stations. Strangers were thrown together for days, sharing meager food rations and blankets in gymnasiums illuminated only by emergency lights. These shelters became islands of warmth in a frozen sea, where social barriers broke down and communities bonded over survival. For many, these 3 or 4 days in the shelter became a defining memory of resilience and human kindness. For those lucky enough to make it home, the challenge was staying warm as the power grid failed across the region. With temperatures well below freezing and winds howling through the cracks, indoor temperatures plummeted dangerously fast. Families huddled into single rooms, closing off the rest of the house, and slept in piles of coats and blankets. Without electricity, there was no television or news, leaving millions in an information blackout, terrified and wondering if the storm would ever end. In this paralyzed landscape, the snowmobile suddenly became the most valuable vehicle in America. Civilians with sleds became deputized heroes, ferrying doctors to hospitals and delivering insulin and baby formula to isolated homes. They could glide over the massive drifts that had swallowed cars and fences, acting as the only lifeline for the elderly and sick. Police officers rode on the backs of snowmobiles to patrol neighborhoods, creating a unique partnership between the authorities and the public. In the Midwest, specifically Ohio and Indiana, the sheer cold was the deadliest factor. The wind chill dropped to 60 degrees below zero, a temperature where exposed flesh freezes in under a minute. Farmers faced a heartbreaking struggle to reach their livestock in barns that were buried under drifts, reaching the eaves. Many cattle and pigs were lost, frozen standing up or buried when barn roofs collapsed under the unimaginable weight of the snow. The agricultural disaster was devastating, destroying livelihoods in a matter of 48 hours. As the storm dragged on into its 3rd day, the isolation in rural areas became a life-or-death emergency. The military launched a massive airlift operation, flying helicopters over the frozen wasteland to spot people waving from rooftops or windows. They dropped hay bales of food for starving livestock in emergency, rations for families trapped miles from the nearest cleared road. It was the largest domestic relief mission of its kind, proving that the government had to treat the blizzard like a foreign invasion. Leadership became crucial, and Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis became the face of the crisis management. He famously appeared on television wearing a simple sweater instead of a suit, projecting a calm, working-man image that comforted the panicked public. He took the unprecedented step of banning all non-emergency traffic for nearly a week, declaring that anyone driving would be arrested. This controversial but necessary decision allowed the cleanup crews to finally gain ground on the mountains of snow. The deep freeze had consequences that rippled through the economy, specifically in the energy sector. The Ohio River, a major artery for transporting coal to power plants, froze completely solid, trapping barges in the ice. This threatened to shut down power plants that were already struggling to keep up with the demand for heating. The energy crisis deepened the misery, forcing rolling blackouts and urgent pleas for citizens to lower their thermostats to save the grid from total collapse. The accumulation was so intense that many people physically could not open their front doors. In suburban neighborhoods, residents had to climb out of second-story windows or dig tunnels through the snow just to get outside. It was a disorienting experience. Landmarks were gone, street signs were buried, and the world had been smoothed over into unrecognizable white shapes. People walked over the tops of buried cars without even realizing vehicles were beneath their feet. Once the winds finally died down, a strange and euphoric atmosphere took over the buried cities. With cars banned and work cancelled, adults and children took to the streets on cross-country skis and sleds. Major avenues, usually choked with traffic, became playgrounds, and neighbors who had never spoken before shared food and stories over the snowbanks. It was a brief moment of utopia and silence in the city, a stark contrast to the terror of the previous days. However, as the cleanup began, the grim reality of the storm's toll was revealed. Rescue crews moving systematically down highways began the heartbreaking task of digging out the thousands of abandoned cars. In some vehicles, they found drivers who had succumbed to hypothermia or carbon monoxide poisoning while trying to stay warm. The parking lot of doom on Route 128 became a crime scene of sorts, marking the tragic end for those who couldn't escape the fury of the storm. The blizzard achieved something that few events in history ever could. It completely shut down the relentless world of professional sports. The Boston Garden sat silent and dark, with Celtics and Bruins games cancelled because neither the players nor the fans could reach the arena. It was the first time in the 26-year history of the Beanpot Hockey Tournament that the games were postponed. This silence in the cathedrals of sports signaled to everyone just how serious the situation truly was. When the final count was tallied, the statistics were sobering and horrific. Approximately 100 people lost their lives across the affected region, making it one of the deadliest winter events in American history. The storm caused nearly $1 billion in damage in 1978 currency, which would be well over $4 billion today. It wasn't just a weather event. It was a mass casualty incident that left deep psychological scars on the survivors. The logistics of removing the snow presented a problem that engineers hadn't planned for. There was simply no place to put it. The piles were so massive that cities had to secure emergency permission to dump the snow into harbors and rivers, something usually forbidden due to pollution. Dump trucks ran 24 hours a day, forming convoys that moved millions of tons of white powder into the Atlantic. It took weeks just to clear enough space for 2 lanes of traffic on major highways. Yet, amidst the tragedy and the cold, life found a way to continue. Dozens of so-called blizzard babies were born during the height of the storm, often delivered in homes or in the back of police vehicles. Stories emerged of sled convoys transporting laboring mothers to hospitals through the howling wind. These children, now adults, carry the legacy of the storm in their birth certificates, living proof of life's persistence against the elements. The Great Blizzard of '78 revolutionized the National Weather Service and the science of meteorology. The failure to adequately warn the public about the severity of the storm led to massive investments in computer modeling and satellite technology. It changed the protocol for winter storm warnings, ensuring that terms like blizzard warning carried a gravity that would trigger immediate government action. Today, we benefit from the hard lessons learned during those 3 dark days in January. The storm quickly entered the cultural lexicon, becoming a badge of honor for anyone who lived through it. "I survived the blizzard of '78" t-shirts and bumper stickers appeared everywhere, symbolizing a shared triumph over adversity. It became the singular event that defined a generation in the Northeast and Midwest, a common reference point that strangers could bond over instantly. Even decades later, it is the standard conversation starter whenever snow begins to fall. The physical landscape of the coastline was permanently altered by the violence of the tides. Beaches were eroded, cliffs collapsed, and property lines were effectively redrawn by the ocean. The storm destroyed historical landmarks and piers that had stood for a century, erasing pieces of local history in a single weekend. Rebuilding these coastal communities took years, and strict new building codes were enforced to prevent such destruction from happening again. The thaw was a slow, messy, and revealing process that lasted well into February. As the mountains of snow turned to slush, they revealed the debris of a society that had been paused: bicycles, trash cans, and cars that had been crushed by The region woke up from its hibernation, groggy and battered, but ready to rebuild. The melting snow also brought minor flooding, a final parting insult from the storm before it vanished into history. Decades have passed, and while technology has improved, the Great Blizzard of 1978 remains a haunting reminder of our vulnerability. It taught us that, no matter how advanced our civilization becomes, nature always holds the winning hand. It was a perfect storm of timing, physics, and geography that may not be seen again for 100 years. But for those who heard the wind howl in '78, the memory of the whiteout will never fade.